General McMaster, thank you for coming to Toronto to be part of this debate. We're really looking forward to your words tonight.
Hey, thanks, Ryder. It's a real privilege to be here. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, it's a privilege to host you. Let's jump right in here and talk a little bit about your overall view of China and its role in the world today. I'm interested that you see this conflict as not necessarily a conflict just about economics. You think that there's almost an existential dimension to it, that it's a conflict between the democratic world order and a very powerful rising regime that has, in your view, authoritarian characteristics. Explain that for us.
Well, I wouldn't say it's an existential conflict. I think it's a competition. It's a competition with a Chinese Communist Party and the policies of that party that aim to stifle any kind of freedom and individual rights within their own society, but then also export that model to other countries in an effort really to challenge the international system as it exists and replace it really with a new order that's sympathetic to Chinese interests, with China, as President Xi has said, at the center of that order. And so really in many ways, this is an attempt, I think, to reestablish the tributary system in Chinese dynastic history, in which countries that sign up can enjoy free trade as long as they are in a servile relationship with China. And so I think China poses a significant threat to our free and open societies.
Now, you're going to hear an argument at this debate about the extent to which who is the biggest beneficiary of the liberal international order, at least over the last number of decades. Surely that's China. So why would China threaten a global system that has been so favorable to them in terms of their economic indicators, in terms of just the health of the society that they've created?
Right. Well, it's important to remember that after the Cultural Revolution that Mao used, to purge the party and really destroyed the Chinese economy. The Chinese economy in the 1980s was a basket case. So it was really the West, the international order, welcoming China in that helped China have a tremendously successful period of economic growth, lifting 800 million people out of poverty. And the way China did that was to reform. And so there were reasons to be optimistic in the post-Cold War period that China, having been welcomed into the order, would continue to liberalize its economy. And as China prospered, China would play by the rules, and then ultimately it would actually liberalize its political system as well. Well, what's happened is those economic reforms, they stalled under Hu Jintao, and they completely went into reverse under Xi Jinping. Last year, 2018, was the first year in which the Chinese private sector did not grow, and it was the first time that the percentage of the economy, the Chinese economy, that was state-driven, the state-owned economy, grew in percentage relative to the private economy. And this is because what Xi Jinping is endeavoring to do, more than any other objective to pursue, is to tighten its exclusive grip, the party's exclusive grip on power. And it sees these structural aspects of the state-driven authoritarian capitalist model as essential to maintaining the party's grip on power.
Another question that probably comes up in this debate is, well, why is America paying attention to this now? I mean, you had the last 20, 30 years to think through what your China policy should be. It seems to be a hard pivot right now from a more dovish view earlier to something you might describe as hawkish. Why is that happening?
I think it's because of the recognition that the assumptions on which previous policies were based are false. I mean, you hosted a great debate here 8 years ago, and David Lee was one of the debaters. And in that debate, David Lee said, look, we are liberalizing. And he gave some examples. He said, Chinese people can express their opinions now. And he said, our young generation won't be satisfied, and they're going to demand even more reforms. Well, that young generation is being brainwashed and brutally repressed by the state's really tight grip on the information that they have access to, and then really the stifling of any kind of ideas or discussions involving concepts like rule of law, right? If you talk about rule of law and you're a professor or a student, you get arrested. Many of these students were arrested and they disappeared until they reappeared later in confession videos. Books on rule of law are taken down off university bookshelves and destroyed. Even Marxist organizations, that were advocating for workers' rights, those universities in which that was happening, those buildings were raided and the students arrested. And so what's happened is I think, a broad recognition, really not in the United States, but in the world, that China does not intend to liberalize. China does not intend to play by the rules, and in fact, wants to break apart the international order and replace it with a new order sympathetic to the Chinese Communist Party. And so what you see is 16 other nations joining Canada in December of 2018 in calling out the sustained campaign of industrial espionage against Western companies. What you see is a great deal of cooperation internationally in confronting China's effort to control the ocean. And nobody controls the ocean, and this is the islands that they're developing in the South China Sea and militarizing those islands. So I think this is really one of the few things in the United States these days that brings both parties together. But it's also, I think, a recognition on the part of our free and open societies that China is actually advocating, as the European Union just announced last month, China is advocating a system that would undermine everything we hold dear in terms of universal rights and free and open and fair and reciprocal trade and economic relations.
A couple other counter arguments to try out on you. The first is that some people will posit the reason America is focusing on this now is that they realize that China is a technological and economic threat. And that in a sense, you're trying to create a global alliance to push back against China, not to defend the liberal international order or universal values, but to defend America's narrow national interests. Why do you reject that assumption?
Well, I reject that because what the Chinese Communist Party is doing is pursuing a strategy that they call military-civil fusion. And as you know, in this Directive 9 that leaked, a few years ago. I mean, if you're Chinese and you even talk about it, you get thrown into prison. But it essentially revealed the strategy of the Chinese Communist Party, which is to direct an integrated effort across academia, private companies and industries, and the military. And what they want to do is to gain dominance, global dominance of the emerging economy, and then also to apply emerging technologies to military capabilities in a way that allows them to pursue their objectives, which are dangerous to all nations. Those that are on the periphery of China essentially would become vassal states as China endeavors to develop exclusionary areas of influence across the Indo-Pacific region, and then challenges the United States and other free and open societies globally. If you look at who their client states are, I mean, it's Venezuela in the Western Hemisphere. It's Zimbabwe in Africa. It's Cambodia on its periphery, and so these are oppressive regimes. And what you might say is that the Chinese Communist Party is trying to make the world safe for authoritarianism, because that's how they can extend their influence most effectively.
Right. Another argument in this debate is that China will say, look, we're actually a good global citizen. We're a member of the Paris Accord. We didn't pull out of that agreement like the United States. You complain obviously about our assertion of territorial rights over the South China Seas, but we're a signatory of the UN law of the sea. The United States is not. There's a whole series of examples like that where China seems to be a good multilateral actor, whereas the recent tenor of American engagement in the world seems more unilateralist. How do you respond to that?
Well, China actually participates in international fora so they can undermine those institutions and bend them toward their agenda to achieve this hegemonic influence and to put China back at the center stage. So, for example, China was welcomed in 2001 into the World Trade Organization and pledged to liberalize its economy, to stop the state subsidies to state-owned enterprises, to stop the forced transfer of intellectual property just for the privilege of doing business in their economy. They didn't make good on any of those promises. And then even though the United States is not a signatory to the international treaty in terms of freedom of navigation and so forth, the U.S. adheres to it and is a good international participant and really enforcer of international law. China is breaking that law every day in the continued reclamation efforts and militarization in the South China Sea, for example. And also, I think what China is doing, for example, in the Paris Accords, is what they want is they want to portray their behavior as supportive of the international order, even as they undermine these efforts. So China is poisoning the global environment, even as they adhere to actually an agreement that's pretty flawed. I mean, the problem with the Paris Accord is it gave us a false sense of security. It didn't really address the world's biggest polluters. China, India, and others, but China mainly. And China, under the One Belt, One Road initiative, is exporting 260 coal-fired plants to places like South Africa and Kenya. And so they're trying to appear as if they're a good citizen while they're actually undermining the system.
This is obviously a very personal issue for you, and I'm wondering why you've chosen to speak out about it. Was there something that happened in your career? Were you previously part of that other foreign establishment that thought, oh, look, China's not a threat, they'll reform, and then you had a kind of an epiphany moment? Or is this your experience in the White House that's led you to this firm set of beliefs?
Well, I mean, the vast majority of my career was spent in Europe and in the Middle East and Central Asia. And of course, China always figures prominently across the world. And I had been a student of Chinese history. I taught it as part of our survey course at West Point. But I really didn't focus on China very much until I came into the job as National Security Advisor. And so one of the important aspects of that job, I think, is to examine existing policy and I think to challenge assumptions on which policies are based. And once we took a look at the old policy of strategic engagement with China, and we identified that it was underpinned by this really implicit and now, I think, demonstrably false assumption that China would behave in a way that's supportive of the international order, then we recognized that we really needed a shift. We needed to shift toward a policy that acknowledged that we are in a competition with an authoritarian closed system that is not only really repressing its own people, but also exporting its model to others. And so by recognizing the need to compete, we thought this was the best way to have a conversation with the Chinese Communist Party and to say, this is not in your interest to behave this way, and to get off the path that could lead to confrontation. I think China, because it had gone unchallenged for so long, was becoming more and more aggressive. And I think that this strategy of competition rather than just engagement in the belief that China would liberalize was appropriate. And I think what you're seeing is the adoption of that approach really across the world. I mean, from within the European Union, across North America, our friends in our hemisphere here in the Western Hemisphere are very concerned about the effect of for example, the Chinese debt trap that they use to try to co-opt and then coerce countries to support China's foreign policy. Ecuador is a great example. I mean, a $2 billion dam in a lake at the base of an active volcano.
Right.
And the turbines in this dam are clogged with silt and trees. And the first time it was fired up, it blew out the whole electrical system in Ecuador.
Right.
And it already has cracks in it. And of course, what China's done in this sort of predatory economic strategy that they're implementing is in exchange for building this dam and to service the debt associated with it, China now takes 80% of Ecuador's oil exports at a discount and resells those on the market.
Wow.
Look at Venezuela. China is making money on the backs of the starving Venezuelan people. And they're doing that by propping up Maduro with continued cash flow, while Maduro, again, sells almost all their oil now to the Chinese, who don't use any of it. They just sell it at a markup, and China's profiting while the Venezuelan people are starving. And so I think it's not just the United States or the Republican Party in the United States. This has tremendous, I think, nonpartisan support. The recognition that we have to really recognize, this kind of pernicious danger to our free and open societies.